Hi class, Mickey Lorkowski here. This is the first lecture video of the semester, so in addition to covering the Russell Value of Philosophy lecture, we'll also talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts, what you should be getting out of these, etc. So, as always, always and forever in this course, your job is understanding. Your goal with the lectures is to understand the material, and your job on the exams is to show understanding of the material. Remember, exams are performative. Show that you understand. Um, Obviously, I'm not that interested in memorization, although knowing the facts is required to understand. So focus on understanding. Make sure you can explain them in your own words, evaluate, articulate a position, etc. And we'll say more on this when we get towards the Unit 1 exam review period, but also see the syllabus for suggestions on how to succeed in the course documents. So that's thing one. Thing two, let's talk about how we do that. First of all, these video lectures are a small part of that. Just think in terms of class time, these videos tend to take about 20 minutes, where I just kind of hit the meat and potatoes of it, to use an old expression. But in class would be an hour and 15 minutes. So clearly a 20-minute lecture video can't replace an hour and 15 minutes in class. To bridge some of that gap, that's why we have the other resources online. So, of course, before you watch one of the lecture videos, just like before attending a lecture, you should be reading the material and reading it for understanding, not just letting your eyes pass over it. But second of all, it's important to realize um, after you've done the video, your job's not done. So watch the video as much as you want. That's why it's available. I've made it available on YouTube instead of privately through Blackboard, because YouTube has a fantastic closed captioning circuit, and that helps people take notes and such sometimes. So use those resources. But beyond that, we have the discussion boards in class. Now, you might ask a lot of different questions. If your question is a question of a personal nature, of course, don't use the discussion board. Shoot me an email. If your question is about the course, not about the material, but about the course, so for instance, if you had a question about the format of the exams, um, that's the kind of thing to put in the Ask Your Instructor discussion board. However, if you have a question about the material, then there's a questions about the material discussion board for each of the lectures I do pretty much. And you'll find those in the corresponding units. So if you have a question specifically about Russell, like, well, I don't know what he means about the greatness of the objects of study, that's the kind of thing that if you cannot find that answer on your own, you want to make sure to post in the questions discussion board. And we do that because it's like asking the question in class. All of your classmates can benefit from the answer, but the other nice thing about putting in the discussion board, it's there. It's visible, so everybody can look at the questions discussion boards as part of their preparation for the exam. They can look at what questions there were, they could look at what answers I gave, etc. So it's very nice to have that resource, so if you are willing to do it, I strongly encourage you to do so. The other discussion board is for reasoned opinions. So assuming you do understand the material, what do you think about it and why? Uh, you can go big picture. It's better to talk about a small part of it. And through a lot of these lectures, I might suggest something to write on. I'll certainly do that today with the Russell. So watch for those, but really you could write on anything you want. Just take some aspect of the material, tell me what you think about it and why. Should take maybe 2 substantive paragraphs to get full credit for a week. Um, but of course you can do smaller replies as well, so see the syllabus for a little more breakdown on that. All right. By the way, that pause there is I'm so used to saying, are there any questions about that? And well, hopefully there will be some, and they'll be posted in the appropriate places. So let's start talking about Russell. Russell was a relatively contemporary philosopher working in the 20th century. He was lucid well into his 90s and did philosophy for pretty much all of his adult life. So you're talking about someone who's had almost 70 years of being a professional philosopher and publishing. And towards the end of his life, he's had a lot of thoughts on philosophy about what worked, what didn't, where philosophy should and shouldn't be focusing, etc. And he put this all together in this little little summative uh, reader book called The Problems of Philosophy. Our assigned reading that we're talking about is the final chapter of that text, called The Value of Philosophy. Now, importantly, and hopefully as I remembered to mention in our last meeting, we need to be doing a couple of things with the Russell, and really they're almost an introduction to the whole unit. So first we're going to look at Russell's definition of philosophy and what that entails and what it doesn't entail, which is really a good definition for several reasons and is something we'll be returning to, and it will be our working definition of philosophy for the rest of the course. But then Russell's also going to try to motivate us a little bit about talking about why philosophy as a discipline is worth pursuing. And by pursuing, I mean not necessarily getting a degree in it, but really seeing the value in asking the right kinds of questions, seeing the value in seriously contemplating those questions and what a good answer would look like. So that's what we're going to do today. Consider that the lecture in two parts. So Russell starts his chapter, these topics, by juxtaposing, that is, putting next to each other, philosophy and the sciences. So the sciences very broadly is what you would normally think of. And comparing and contrasting those is helpful. The biggest, most important part of this comparison, cannot emphasize it enough, is that both disciplines, that is philosophy and the sciences, pursue truths. Okay? So philosophy has no interest in opinion, regardless of Hollywood stereotypes. We pursue facts in philosophy. We pursue certain types of facts. And just think of a few philosophical questions. Well, is there a God of a certain description or not? That's a yes-no question. There either is or is not such a being. And opinion doesn't enter into it. Or is this new law just? Is a good philosophical question. Is there free will? Is a good philosophical question. So philosophy pursues truths, period. We are interested in looking for facts. But now we can start to see where Russell's definition of philosophy is going to come from, because if both philosophy and the sciences are pursuing facts, the difference must be in which kinds of facts they are pursuing. So, roughly speaking, the sciences pursue empirical facts. That is, the kind of things we can learn with the senses, aided or unaided. All the stuff the sciences and history normally does, those are empirical pursuits. And so, once we realize that philosophy is different than science in this way, we arrive at Russell's definition of philosophy, two-parter. Philosophy is the pursuit of truths that cannot be determined empirically. So let me say that again. Russell's definition of philosophy, the pursuit of truths that cannot be determined empirically. So this definition is really nice for a lot of reasons. It obviously distinguishes philosophy from the sciences, but also, if you remember a little bit from our introductory chat, there's this strange phenomena that there's a lot of fields that used to be philosophy that aren't anymore. Biology used to be philosophy. Astronomy used to be philosophy. Psychology used to be philosophy. And so what ends up happening, Russell's definition of philosophy tells why these pursuits moved from philosophy into the sciences. Well, it used to be the case that these truths couldn't be determined empirically, but as our methods and our tools have improved over the years, then we can start to determine what a star is composed of empirically, and so astronomy moves out of philosophy and into the sciences. So that's two nice things we've said so far. The third nice thing, though, Russell's definition of philosophy does capture the kinds of things that philosophy studies nowadays. And so, talk about some of the big picture kind of subfields of philosophy. Metaphysics, literally the kinds of things that are beyond physics. Is there a God of a certain sort or not? Is there free will or not? Goes beyond physics. The sciences can neither confirm nor deny. What are the laws of nature? Not identify how they work, but what kind of thing are they? That's a really weird question. You don't believe me? Really just start thinking about the law of gravity. Well, where is it? Is it in every object? Is it something that is above all objects? Those are weird questions, but those are all in metaphysics, literally beyond physics. Another big sub branch of philosophy, and one of the reasons that philosophy gets to tell all the other disciplines how to do their job, is epistemology. Epistemology is theory of knowledge. It asks questions like, what is knowledge? When do I have it, and when do I not have it? So notice the reason there's disciplines like philosophy of science, philosophy of biology, philosophy of physics is, well, if I want to generate good knowledge in the field of physics, first I have to know what constitutes good knowledge, and that's a question of epistemology, which is why there's a lot of these, or at least part of why there's a lot of these philosophy ofs that you might have heard of, such as philosophy of physics or philosophy of science. So, what is knowledge is a philosophical question, a very important one. Another big one is value theory. So, ethics, right and wrong, political philosophy, what is just and what is not, aesthetics, what is beauty. Those all get kind of smushed together into this subfield of philosophy called value theory, which always cracks me up because whenever someone asks what is the value of philosophy, they don't seem to realize they've just asked a philosophical question. And so, in an important sense, they've already answered themselves. If I even want to talk about value, I have to talk philosophy. Value isn't built into biology. Comes from something else, at least our accounts of it. So those are kind of the big three, and then logic and critical thinking is the fourth area. Now, when I give you lists, I will never ask you to memorize a list. I give you these lists because it helps kind of get your brain going about, well, what is philosophy? What kind of questions does it cover? That's all. We will focus on some of these sub-disciplines of philosophy as we go through. So, Russell tells us philosophy is the pursuit of truths that can't be determined empirically. That's nice because it separates it from the sciences. Tells us why disciplines used to be philosophy but aren't anymore. Tells us why the kind of philosophy roster we have is what it is and successfully captures what philosophy studies nowadays. Probably not much more is going to move out of philosophy into the sciences. But a fourth reason that's nice, at least for the purposes of this course, if you look at what we're studying over the next few days, is logic. And if you think about it, Russell's definition tells us why. If we want to achieve truth, that is, if we want to get at facts, but we can't use our microscope and telescope and our empirical methods to figure out those facts, we need some other method for getting to those facts. And that's what logic and reasoning does. So logic allows us to take what we know and figure out if we actually know other things based on it. To take a really trivial and oversimplified example we will return to, using logic, if I already know that all men are mortal, and I already know that Socrates is a man, I can make an inference and realize I also know that Socrates is mortal. So the other nice thing about the Russell definition, at least it gives a tip of the cap of why we must study logic, at least in the very, very general and basic sense, in order to do more philosophy. And so that will be our next stop after the Russell. So that's all I have to say about the definition of philosophy, but Russell adds a couple more important compare and contrast with the sciences. The rest are mainly contrasting. One thing that Russell says about sciences versus philosophy, he says that the value of the sciences come from the payoff. So we value the sciences based on what it can do for us. And overall, that seems right. How excited would you be if you found out that fully half of your tuition money for the semester went to a massive study determining exactly how many blades of grass there were on all Kent State campuses? You would probably be furious and saying, well, wait a minute, we're determining a new fact. Isn't that awesome? Is probably not going to assuage you there. Facts of the sciences are like that. If they don't do anything for us, we don't care. And so we tend to value sciences based on the payoff. By contrast, Russell says that philosophy is a good of the mind. And what does that mean? Roughly the opposite. That, well, the value comes in doing it. The value comes in, kind of making ourselves go through these thoughts and exercises rather than any effect in the world. Having said that, does philosophy benefit your life, and has it benefited your life? Sure, all the time. And we'll get back to that, because the other thing he says that distinguishes sciences and philosophy, he says that we don't need to understand science to benefit from science. And so, for instance, I can benefit from plane travel, or at least I could before COVID. I could benefit from plane travel without understanding the physics of lift. Actually, I have no trouble understanding the physics of lift, but I have no idea how ones and zeros become pictures of cats on my phone. That's beyond me. But I could still benefit from them. And so with the sciences, we don't need to understand in order to benefit. Russell kind of says that philosophy is the same way, but he kind of undercuts that point later. So I think probably being charitable to Russell, what he means to say, is that philosophy best benefits us when we understand it, when we're doing it. But of course, it doesn't have to be. And Russell even points to some places later where philosophy has benefited us. So good thing to talk about on the discussion board is, well, where has philosophy benefited you as an individual, even if you haven't done philosophy? So let me get you warmed up with a few examples. If you feel you've benefited from the separation of church and state, or the Bill of Rights generally, thank a philosopher. If you feel that you've benefited from the refining of the scientific method, thank a philosopher. If you feel you've benefited from women being allowed to vote and allowed to attend school, thank a philosopher. So, of course, philosophy has done quite a bit for us. So, if you want to discuss a few ways in which philosophy has benefited the society as a whole, which, of course, means it's benefited you, that's an easy thing to talk about. And so that's mainly what I want to say in terms of the distinctions between the philosophy and the sciences for Russell, and it always helps us to kind of keep in mind the similarities and differences. Most important similarity, both pursue truth. Most important differences have to do with which truths are pursued, and as Russell tells us, how we value them, where value comes from. And he thinks that even though philosophy does have some of the same values of the sciences and benefiting us, etc., he doesn't think that's our main value. Put another way, if philosophy had never radically reformed society, we would still value it. And so we need to talk about what some of those values are. And so that's the second half of the Russell reading. He's going to start talking about, well, what is it that philosophy can do? Why is it such a valuable discipline? And he gives this kind of longish list. I've listed them in the review sheet. And notice they kind of bleed together a little bit. And so, again, we don't memorize lists, especially because these aren't always entirely distinct. So I'm just going to talk about some of the main themes that Russell identifies here. Another good topic, if you want to write in the thoughts about the material discussion board, which of these seems the most important to you and why? Could be a good thing to discuss. So let's begin at the beginning. He says that philosophy doesn't get its value from a definite body of knowledge. Careful. He's not saying philosophy is all your opinion. No, we've already established philosophy pursues truth. What he means by definite is it's the kind of thing that cannot be confirmed empirically. So remember, let's go back just one more time to the definition I summed up. The pursuit of truths that cannot be determined empirically. All right. Let's say just a little bit about determining. I feel like that's probably a valuable sidebar here. So, think about an action. By the way, I like to use silly examples because they're memorable. I hope I'm not offending anyone. And if I'm offending someone who's not in my class who's watching my YouTube video, I don't care. Leave me alone. But, so imagine an action. Imagine you see me, Mickey Lurkowski, this guy, at Walmart, run up and punt a toddler over the aisle. All right, well, here's a philosophical question. Did you see something wrong? Well, of course, yes. You saw something monstrous, in fact. But what can the sciences tell us about that action? Well, the field of physics could probably say a lot about angle of trajectory, where the toddler will land, etc. That doesn't tell me it's wrong. The medical sciences might be brought in, talk about the probable damage to the toddler, but doesn't tell me wrong. Psychology could come in, talk about, what the F is wrong with Mickey Lurkowski, who might make him do this. Could talk about psychological damage to the child and to that child's parents. Political science could be brought in and talk about whether it's legal or not. So, but none of those tell me wrong. Illegal is not the same as wrong. And so, where does wrong come from? Ask the question we should have started with. What is it that makes that wrong? And you're probably going to say something like, well, causing unnecessary harm is wrong. Great, I really hope you believe that. But notice that's a philosophical truth. Nothing about biology is going to confirm or deny that. And so notice biology can't make that claim definite. It's obviously true, but it's not the kind of thing that biology can confirm or deny, or any of the other sciences can confirm or deny. And that's what he means by the value is not from or part of what he means about when he talks about a definite body of knowledge. But notice, and this one more aside, philosophy and the sciences aren't these completely separate disciplines. Because as soon as I grant this one little philosophical point, right and wrong are determined by harm and benefit. That's a view in ethics called utilitarianism. Then I could use the sciences to figure out what harms people, what benefits people, and therefore become a better person if I want to. So philosophy and the sciences always need each other. Never think otherwise. But what kind of value is there in this lack of definiteness? Why is it valuable that biology can neither confirm or deny it? Here it gets a little tricky because I used a very blatant case. There's not intelligent disagreement in that case. But there is intelligent disagreement about lots of stuff in ethics. There is intelligent disagreement. By intelligent, I mean good argument and reasoning rather than screaming matches, but there is plenty of good intelligent disagreement surrounding abortion, capital punishment, etc. And there's value in the disagreement, says Russell. What kind of value comes from disagreement? We have to think about our own positions. We have to admit when we're wrong. We have to think this all-important question, why do I believe something is right or wrong? And really confront my own reasons in that. And there's tremendous value in that. Why is the most important question? And articulating why you believe things is a really important philosophical exercise that we're just scratching the surface of. Those are valuable. Realizing your opponent has good reasons to believe what they believe is also valuable. It leads to intellectual humility, leads to compromise, leads to not strawmanning your opponent's positions. Lots of good stuff comes from intelligent disagreement. David Hume, philosopher we'll read a little later in the semester, is supposed to have said, truth springs from disagreement among friends. And that's something we're going to try to keep in mind in this course. So there's value in the ability to intelligently disagree. That's probably a better way to say what Russell says. There are a lot of good thinking and new and novel solutions come from intelligent disagreement. It doesn't come from forming battle lines or being dogmatic. It comes from a genuine communication, what's sometimes in philosophy called a dialectic. And that's something we'll keep working on this semester as well. So this value in not knowing for certain is great, actually. You might say, wow, really? Yes. Assumed certainty is just anathema to critical, creative thinking. And so the way he kind of sums these points up is when we have this uncertainty and requirement to defend our views, he says that enlarges our thoughts and avoids what he calls the tyranny of custom. What's this tyranny of custom he's talking about? Well, it's this assumption that leads to stagnation that just because something is that way or has been that way in the past, we should continue to do it that way. So let me offer a quick example just to realize what we're talking about. Well, imagine years and years ago in the Dust Bowl, crops were dying everywhere. Someone asks a very important why question. And asking important why questions and articulating and evaluating the answers is what we do in philosophy. Someone said, why think that only that fertilizer can only be composed of organic material? That is, rotting plants and manure and things like that. They asked a why question. So philosophy encourages us to ask those why questions, but also to articulate an answer and evaluate that answer. So the answer was the tyranny of custom. Well, that's how we've always done it in the past. Is that a good answer? Absolutely not. I don't know about you, but I'm glad to have indoor plumbing. So yes, just because things have been done that way in the past doesn't mean it's the right way. So someone asked a why question, got an answer, realized that answer was bad, and then realized, wow, we could have this thing called nitrogen-based fertilizer. Plentiful and actually more efficacious because of that asking of a philosophical why question and evaluating it. Every acre of arable land now produces 7 times as much food as it did before that. Why? Because we used philosophy to get rid of the tyranny of custom that was holding down, in an important sense, agriculture. So if we were certain, even falsely certain, that we could only use organic fertilizer, a lot more people would die of famine. And so philosophy also fights what we sometimes call dogmatism, this false certainty. If you want a technical definition of dogmatism, a dogmatist is someone who basically doesn't change their view according to evidence. So if I have a belief and someone points out strong evidence against that belief, I ignore that evidence and keep believing anyway. That's a dogmatist. As Hume also said, the wise person proportions their belief to evidence. So that's something we'll work on in philosophy. So there's this first kind of, in Russell, this group of why philosophy is nice has to do with not having a definite answer, the value in uncertainty, coming together in the enlarging thought and avoiding the tyranny of custom and fighting dogmatism. Then there's kind of a one-off value of philosophy I thought's kind of interesting. He says it's valuable for the greatness of the objects it studies. Philosophy gets to tackle the really cool stuff, like what is justice? What a great and important question. Getting a good answer on that will drastically improve political discourse in society. That's a really good question. And have we arrived at a perfect answer? Some people think yes, some people think no. But piggybacking to the previous one, the very fact that we're having this discussion, having good arguments, realizing problems, advancing it, we've made tons of advances. And even if we haven't gotten to a perfect definition of justice, which again is debatable, the very fact that we have these conversations deepens and enriches our understanding of justice and makes the world a better place. Philosophy gets to take on a lot of the really cool stuff. Is there free will? Is there a God? What is goodness? So fun. So fun that I, didn't pursue my finance major, and here I am. But anyway, Russell says that has value. Then the last kind of groups of values that comes in here is it has to do with consistency in thought and action. Uh, One of the things that articulating why we believe something is, and evaluating it, is first of all to see if we really actually believe it, but also to make us act accordingly. Human beings, and I'm including myself, human beings are terrible, just mind-numbingly terrible at acting according to our beliefs. And instead, we act in ways that contradicts what we believe. And we do this all the time. It's because human minds are complicated, have a lot of parts that have to come together. We're not always purely rational. But we could be better, and we should be better. So if you want another topic for the Russell discussion board, here's a fun one. Take a belief that you have that is important, and then list some ways that you act against it without stretching your mind too hard. You can usually come up with 10, just easy 10 ways you act against a belief. So for instance, you might have a belief that we should reduce our carbon footprint and leave good resources for the next generation, since we got good resources. But our actions go against that all the time. So in philosophy, it really trains us that we have to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. And when we study Socrates, we will find someone who literally died for his beliefs to do what was right. And then we'll read Epictetus, who was willing to, and just circumstances avoided it. But that's a really deep commitment to really acting according to what you believe. So this brings in a sense of consistency of thought and action, this objectivity, etc. Now, how does it do this? Here's the tricky part. Russell says that it basically breaks the subject-object barrier. Now, what in the world is he talking about there? It's not as hard as you would think. The subject, the person doing the thinking, or the person doing the talking. So that is the person doing the philosophy. The object, what is being thought about? Now, why does philosophy break the subject-object barrier? Because most of the time, the stuff we're doing in philosophy directly affects us. So there's an important sense in which the subject of philosophy is ourselves quite a bit of the time. So for instance, if I do some good, careful philosophical analysis and decide that there is no brain-independent mind, well, then I have to accept that I am just a brain attached to a body, which means, among other things, no afterlife, death is the end, etc. But so most of philosophy, if I think in terms of figuring out what is justice, I've also taught myself, well, what I need to do to be just, which political candidates I need to vote for to make sure I'm having someone who actually aligns themselves with justice, etc. And so when we do philosophy, we are often learning about ourselves. Now, how does that make our thought and action consistent? Well, if I carefully decide, and again, this is an example, I'm not giving you my own beliefs here. If I very clearly and carefully decide that, say, some people believe that abortion is wrong in all non-rape circumstances, well, people often believe that until they get pregnant, and then they start saying, well, I'm in college, this is a really hard time for me, etc. That's the kind of thinking that's normally inconsistent. That's a type of bias that we tend to think that the rules apply to everyone else but not me. You can't get away with that once you're into philosophy. Once you're clearly articulating and evaluating reasons for your beliefs, that goes away. So maybe to take a less touchy example, I might, in a normal class, ask you to raise your hand if you think drunk driving is wrong. Not just illegal, but it's immoral. All the hands will go up, and then I'll point out, well, of course, studies show that texting and driving causes more accidents and fatalities than drunk driving, which means if I want to have consistent beliefs, should I also think that texting and driving is wrong? And of course, you should. And yet, most people will say, yes, of course texting and driving is wrong, but then 20% of you will be texting on your way home. Why? Because everyone thinks they're the exception to the rule. Everyone says, well, of course, other people are unsafe when texting and driving, but I'm safe. That's an exceptionalism bias. You think that you're somehow the exception to the rule. But of course, everyone who's ever caused an accident texting and driving thought they were perfectly safe as well. And so by asking why questions, by realizing what the answers are, what constitutes a good answer, what constitutes a bad answer, it forces us away from that kind of bias and instead forces us to be consistent, to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. And so that's kind of the big second group of advantages to philosophy. And again, we're going to see that especially in the first and second unit. And so watch for that. The third kind of another one of the smaller points. He says it makes philosophy makes us cosmopolitans. What does that mean? Cosmopolitan literally translates into citizen of the universe. Now, what does that mean? Because citizen of the universe, as opposed to citizen of the United States, citizen of Ohio, citizen of Warren, etc. Now, why does philosophy do this, and how, and why is it of value? Great questions. Let's talk about them. First of all, remember what I'm talking about in terms of philosophy is asking the right kind of why questions, providing answers, and evaluating those answers. So if I'm willing to spend, and a lot of people are, if I'm willing to spend $100 on an American charity, say one that helps vets or St. Jude's or what have you, but not an international charity, my action is really committing me to something. So, for instance, it's much easier in terms of price. It's much cheaper to save a child's life almost anywhere else in the world besides in the US. So if my interest is in saving children's lives, I should be donating to Oxfam instead of St. Jude's. And if I'm not, we have to ask the philosophical question. Well, why think that a child dying in the United States is worth the same as 400 children dying in Togo? Because you could basically save 400 children for the same amount, roughly, probably actually more. And we ask that kind of question, and we very often realize there's not very good answers. And so what the thing about philosophy that makes us citizens of the universe is we realize that drawing a line on land is pretty arbitrary. It is pretty arbitrary to say this line matters. Anyone south of it is worth 500 times as much as anyone north of it. That is a very peculiar type of answer, and it's in anything but, say, legal political action, it's not a very good answer. And so philosophy, first of all, realizes kind of the arbitrariness of political boundaries, but then more generally, if we focus on a philosophical question, what makes a human life have value? That's a good philosophical question. Very few people say the country they're born in. That's not a good answer. And so the other way in which philosophy kind of makes us cosmopolitans is we'll realize that what has value independent of where it's at. And so we kind of focus on these more important things, etc. So says Russell. So that's about what I have to say on here. Again, you should be treating these lectures as the first part of your education in this way. You should also be engaging both discussion boards as necessary in order to come to an understanding in the Russell. So make sure you're doing that, and see you next time.